When Estelle Getty passed away in 2008, her longtime Los Angeles home, a modest but elegant property tucked into the Hollywood Hills, sat vacant for years. The house had charm, but also a strange heaviness about it. Neighbors remembered her fondly, describing her as a woman who brought warmth into the neighborhood. But they also noted that in her later years she had struggled with dementia, and the once lively house grew quiet, its windows always shuttered. By 2019, the property finally went back on the market. A young couple, Daniel and Claire Mitchell, purchased it. They were drawn to its old Hollywood charm. Vaulted ceilings, a sunlit living room, and walls that still held faint marks of a life lived in the limelight. Claire, a freelance writer, thought it would be the perfect place to build her career, while Daniel, an up-and-coming producer, liked the history tied to the address. They didn't mind that the real estate agent had vaguely mentioned the unsettled energy some visitors felt there. To them, it was just a story. The first weeks were uneventful. They painted, unpacked, and invited friends over for drinks. But soon, Claire began to notice small disturbances. Cupboard doors left open after she had closed them. The sound of shuffling footsteps in the hallway late at night when Daniel was asleep, and faint whispers near the den. She tried to dismiss it as stress or imagination. Daniel, too, had his own encounters, though he was less willing to admit them. While working late in the converted office, once Estelle's sitting room, he would hear the faint creak of someone lowering into a chair across from him, though no one was there. Lights flickered, and the air grew noticeably colder whenever he worked past midnight. Neighbors began to share things, too. One older woman, who had known Estelle, told Claire she often saw lights turn on and off in the house, even when it was supposedly empty. She loved entertaining, the woman said. Maybe she's still doing it. The most unnerving moment came one night in the living room. Claire was writing when she heard laughter, soft but distinct, coming from the corner of the room. A woman's laughter, familiar yet strained. When she turned, the sound stopped, but she swore she saw the faint outline of someone seated on the couch, as if waiting for company. The couple tried to rationalize it. Old wiring, settling noises, stress. But the encounters grew more personal. Claire would find framed photos from their boxes, pictures of Estelle Getty from her career placed in odd spots around the house, though she had never displayed them. One morning, Daniel found the television switched to reruns of The Golden Girls, even though neither of them had touched the remote. The activity became harder to ignore when guests began to notice it, too. A friend staying overnight said she felt someone gently sit on the edge of the bed, as though tucking her in. Another reported hearing a raspy voice say, "Thank you for visiting," when she left the kitchen. By the end of the year, Daniel and Claire stopped laughing off the strange happenings. They believed Estelle's presence lingered, not maliciously, but with an intensity that reminded them the house had once belonged to someone who wasn't ready to be forgotten. They still live there today, though they keep quiet about the haunting. They've learned to live with the disturbances, almost treating them as part of the home's character. Claire even admits she feels a strange comfort at times, as though the house isn't empty when Daniel travels. "It's like she's still here," she once confided to a friend. Not in a scary way, but in a way that makes it feel like this was always her place and we're just guests. The Mitchells had been in the house for a little over 3 months when the atmosphere shifted in a way they couldn't quite put into words. At first, there had been nothing but excitement, the charm of moving into a home with history, the joy of arranging their bookshelves in the sunlit living room, the satisfaction of cooking late dinners together in the vintage kitchen, with its tiled countertops that seemed to belong to another era. The house was warm during the day, filled with the rustle of palm trees outside and the faint hum of traffic rising from below the hillside roads. But as night fell, the tone of the house would change. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the way the shadows seemed heavier in the corners, how every sound carried differently, echoing as if the walls remembered conversations spoken long ago. Claire noticed it first when she began working late into the evenings. She would sit with her laptop at the dining room table, sometimes with only a small lamp on, and feel as though the house around her grew watchful. The silence wasn't ordinary silence, it had layers, as though something just beyond her hearing was waiting for her to notice. She found herself glancing toward the hallway more often than she cared to admit, expecting to see movement, a flicker of someone walking past. Of course, there was never anything there, and yet she could never shake the sense that she wasn't entirely alone. One night in particular, while Daniel was still at the studio, she heard the faintest laugh drift through the living room. It was quick, almost playful, the sound of an older woman amused by a private joke. Claire froze, her fingers suspended above the keyboard, listening. The sound came again, softer this time, as though muffled by distance. When she stood and turned toward the room, the laughter stopped, leaving only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the low buzz of the lamp beside her. She didn't tell Daniel that night. Something inside her didn't want to say it out loud, as if naming it would make it more real. Daniel had his own experiences, though his pride kept him from mentioning them until later. He had taken to working in what used to be Estelle's private den, a cozy room with wood-paneled walls and a large window overlooking the city below. It was a perfect space for scripts and phone calls, but late at night, it unsettled him. He often caught the impression that someone was sitting across from him, watching. The leather chair in the corner, a chair they had inherited with the house because the movers couldn't get it through the narrow hallway, always seemed occupied in his peripheral vision. He would glance up quickly, expecting to see Claire or perhaps even the vague outline of a person, but there was never anyone there. Still, the pressure of being observed lingered, heavy enough to make him end calls early, heavy enough to push him into shutting the door behind him when he left the room. The neighbors had their stories, too. Claire was walking the dog one evening when an older woman, Mrs. Hammond, approached her with a hesitant smile. She had lived in the neighborhood since the late 70s and remembered Estelle well. She loved this place, Mrs. Hammond said, glancing toward the Mitchell's house. Always had people over, even when her health wasn't so good. Lights on all night, laughter spilling out into the street. Then, toward the end, it got very quiet. Too quiet. Some of us swore we still saw shadows moving past the windows after she'd gone. She said it with the air of someone sharing a memory, not a warning. But the words lingered in Claire's mind as she walked back up the driveway. The small disturbances grew into something more pointed. Claire found objects in places she hadn't left them, her notebook appearing in the living room after she was sure she had left it in the den. Daniel's keys lined neatly on the mantel when he had dropped them on the kitchen counter. At first, they laughed about it, making jokes about the housekeeper we didn't hire. But after the fifth or sixth time, the humor wore off. Then came the morning when the television in the living room switched itself on, blaring a rerun of The Golden Girls. Claire stood in the doorway, watching the flickering screen, her coffee cooling in her hand. She hadn't touched the remote, and Daniel was still asleep upstairs. When she mentioned it to him, he tried to dismiss it, saying maybe she had leaned on the remote by accident. But that night, as they were heading to bed, Daniel found the remote on the kitchen counter, far from the television. He didn't say anything, but he turned the lock on the bedroom door before getting into bed. By autumn, the presence in the house had grown undeniable. Guests noticed it too. A friend who stayed overnight swore she felt the mattress dip as if someone had sat beside her. Another claimed she heard a raspy but kind voice thanking her as she left the kitchen after dinner. Claire didn't know what to say to these confessions. She couldn't deny them. She had heard and felt too much herself, but admitting it aloud made the house feel heavier somehow, as though acknowledging it gave whatever lingered there more room to exist. Still, it wasn't malicious. That was the strangest part. The house felt inhabited, but not by something cruel. If anything, it was almost protective, like a host unwilling to let go of the life she had built. Claire sometimes found herself speaking aloud, as if to Estelle directly, when she was alone in the house. "We're taking care of it," she whispered one night, standing in the living room with the city lights glowing below. "Don't worry, we love it here." For a moment, she thought she heard the faintest sigh in response, soft, content, like the release of tension from an old memory. And yet, beneath the calm, something deeper stirred. Something they hadn't yet put a name to. Something that reached beyond the playful laughter and moving objects. The house had a pulse to it, a rhythm that neither of them fully understood. And as the days shortened and the nights grew longer, The feeling only intensified, as though whatever lingered within the walls had only just begun to stir. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. By the time November came around, the Mitchells had grown used to living with the peculiarities of their new home, though used to was perhaps not the right phrase. It was more a reluctant adaptation, the way one grows accustomed to the steady dripping of a leaky faucet or the groan of pipes in an old building. They had stopped questioning whether the house was haunted and instead began adjusting their lives around it, leaving certain lamps on at night, avoiding rooms that felt too heavy after dark, speaking a little softer as though their words were being overheard. Claire especially felt the weight of it when she was alone. Daniel's schedule kept him out late more often than not, and she found herself sitting in the living room with only the glow of the city outside to keep her company. There was something uncanny about that room after sunset. The shadows lengthened in peculiar ways, and the air seemed to settle thickly around her shoulders. She often kept the television on, not because she wanted to watch it, but because the sound broke up the silence that otherwise pressed down on her like a held breath. Yet even then, she would sometimes hear another sound threading beneath the dialogue, an almost imperceptible murmur, like someone in the next room talking to themselves. Whenever she muted the television to listen closer, the murmuring stopped, leaving only the faint rattle of branches against the windows. One night she noticed the old leather chair in the den again. Daniel had always joked about getting rid of it, but they had never managed to. It was bulky, heavy, and strangely immovable, as though it had claimed its place in the house and would resist any attempt to dislodge it. Claire began to feel that the chair was not just a piece of furniture but a fixture with presence, as though it were a seat of observation. More than once, passing by the doorway, she caught the brief impression that someone was sitting there just for a fraction of a second, enough to jolt her heart before she realized the chair was empty. She started closing the den door every evening. Yet no matter how tightly she pulled it shut, she often found it ajar again in the morning, open just wide enough to glimpse the chair in the shadows. Daniel, too, was beginning to feel the strain, though he tried to carry himself with stoic disbelief. He had begun avoiding working late in the den altogether, taking his laptop upstairs or to the kitchen. But the house had ways of intruding on him even then. While reviewing a script one night at the dining table, he heard the unmistakable sound of cutlery clinking against porcelain in the kitchen sink. He assumed Claire was washing up and called out to her. There was no answer. When he checked, the kitchen was dark, empty, the sink dry. The sound had been so clear, so precise, that for the first time he felt a cold, creeping certainty that something unseen was moving through the house alongside them. The neighbors grew more forthcoming, perhaps sensing that the Mitchells were no longer dismissing the strange history of the house. Mrs. Hammond, the older woman from down the street, invited Claire for tea one afternoon and spoke of Estelle's final years in the home. She had moments of clarity, the woman explained softly, but also moments when she would speak to people who weren't there. She'd tell us she was rehearsing lines, but sometimes I wondered. She hesitated before continuing. When she passed, some of us thought the house didn't really let her go. It was as if her presence clung to these walls, unwilling to step out completely. Claire listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap, torn between relief that someone else acknowledged what she felt and dread at what it implied. When she returned home, the late afternoon sun was pouring through the windows in long golden beams, but the house still felt cold, its stillness too perfect, too aware. More incidents followed. A faint perfume began to drift through the hallways at night, floral, powdery, distinctly old-fashioned. It would appear suddenly, hang in the air for a few minutes, then vanish without explanation. Once, Daniel woke to find Claire sitting upright in bed, her face pale in the moonlight. She told him she had been woken by a soft voice humming a tune near her ear, a melody she couldn't place but that sounded like it belonged to another decade. She was trembling as she said it, though she insisted the voice hadn't been threatening, only startling, like being reminded that the house still had an unseen occupant. Their guests became quieter about their experiences too. A colleague of Daniel's, after spending an evening there, confessed on his way out that he felt as if someone had been following him from room to room. He laughed as he said it, but the unease in his voice was clear. A week later, Another friend declined to stay overnight, claiming she hadn't been able to sleep the last time, too aware of footsteps pacing softly in the hallway outside the guest room. And through it all, the house itself seemed to breathe. The temperature fluctuated in strange ways, pockets of cold air settling in certain corners even on the warmest days. The lights flickered not in random bursts but almost in rhythm, like a response to their movements. Doors that were shut opened a few inches when no draft should have moved them. It was as if the house was subtly rearranging itself around them, reminding them that they were not the only ones who lived there. Claire began writing about it in her journal, long entries that blurred the line between observation and confession. "It doesn't feel like she's angry," she wrote one night, "but it feels like she doesn't want us to forget this is hers. Sometimes I feel like we're intruding, like we're guests in someone else's life. Maybe she just wants to be remembered." She never showed these entries to Daniel, though she suspected he already knew. The quiet strain between them grew heavier with each passing week. And as December approached, the nights lengthened, the shadows deepened, and the house seemed to stir with a new intensity. The laughter was clearer now, less a faint suggestion and more the distinct sound of someone just out of sight. The perfume lingered longer. The open den door seemed more deliberate, as though inviting them inside. And though neither of them said it out loud, both Daniel and Claire felt the same gnawing truth: whatever lived with them in that house was becoming stronger, more present, more insistent. By the time winter settled in, the Mitchells could no longer pretend their experiences were random or imagined. The house had grown too insistent, too persistent in its intrusions. What had once felt like soft, fleeting reminders of Estelle Getty's presence began pressing into their daily lives with a weight that neither of them could ignore. The breaking point came one evening in late December. Claire had been home alone, curled on the living room couch with a blanket and a book. Outside, the hills were dark and quiet, the city lights far below twinkling like a distant constellation. She was just beginning to drift into a drowsy calm when she heard the unmistakable sound of a woman humming. It came from the corner of the room, near the couch where she sat. Not faint, not imagined, but clear and close. A gentle melody sung in a wavering but affectionate tone, as if to soothe a child. Claire froze, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the shadowy corner where nothing visible stood. The sound continued for nearly a minute before fading into silence. When Daniel came home later that night, she told him everything, her voice unsteady. He listened without interrupting, and for the first time he didn't try to rationalize or dismiss it. Instead, he confessed his own experience from earlier that week. While working in the den, he had looked up to see the reflection in the window. At first, it had been his own figure, dimly lit by the desk lamp. But then, in the reflection, another shape had appeared behind him, small, feminine, seated in the leather chair. Her features were indistinct, blurred as though seen through water, but her posture was unmistakably human. When he turned, the chair was empty. Neither of them slept well after that. Through the holidays, the house became oppressive. They decorated it as best they could, stringing lights along the banister, setting up a modest tree in the corner of the living room, but no matter how bright or festive it looked, the atmosphere remained heavy. Their guests felt it too. One close friend, visiting on Christmas Eve, excused herself suddenly after dinner, pale and shaken. Later she admitted she had heard a voice whisper her name while she was washing her hands in the upstairs bathroom. It was during this period that Claire decided to reach out to someone who might understand. She contacted a local historian who specialized in Hollywood's old neighborhoods, a man named Richard Cole. He agreed to meet with them in the house after New Year's. Richard was polite, methodical, and seemed cautious not to feed into any hysteria. He walked through the rooms slowly, asking about their experiences, pausing now and then as though listening for something himself. Finally, in the den, he spoke quietly. "I don't think what you're experiencing is malicious." Estelle Getty was a performer, a hostess, someone who thrived on presence and company. This house was her stage in a way. She lived here, laughed here, struggled here. When someone spends that many years tied so closely to one space, sometimes a part of them doesn't leave. He ran his hand gently along the back of the leather chair. It's not unusual for a spirit to remain when they feel they still belong. The Mitchells felt a strange comfort in his words, though the reality of them settled uneasily in their bones. That night, for the first time, they spoke to the house directly. After dinner, they sat together in the living room, hands clasped, and Claire spoke aloud. "Estelle, we know this was your home. We love it here and we promise to take care of it. If you want to stay, we understand. Just please don't frighten us." The house was silent. Then, faintly, the smell of powdery perfume filled the room, drifting through the air like a passing acknowledgement. Neither of them spoke of it, but both understood. In the months that followed, the disturbances changed. The laughter continued, but softer now, as if from another room. The perfume still appeared, but only at night, lingering briefly before fading. Objects still moved, but in smaller ways. A picture frame tilted, a chair pushed back an inch from the table as if meant to remind them, not unsettle them. Even the den seemed lighter, though they still left the leather chair where it stood, untouched, as if it belonged more to her than to them. By spring, the house had settled into a strange equilibrium. Friends still felt uneasy when they visited, but Daniel and Claire had grown accustomed to the rhythms of their unseen housemate. They no longer spoke of moving, no longer felt they were intruders. Instead, they had come to see the haunting not as a curse, but as part of the house's identity woven into its walls, its rooms, its very air. Claire once described it in her journal with a kind of reverence. "It isn't frightening anymore. It's like living with memory itself. We don't live in Estelle Getty's house. We live with her in it." And in the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still and the city lights glowed faintly in the distance, the Mitchells sometimes felt a presence in the room with them, watchful, calm, content. They never spoke of it directly, but they both knew the truth. Estelle had never left, and she never would. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.